Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Peter. Yes, so as Andrew said, I am from the States in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I bought a car this week, and when I got in the car with the dealer, he noticed that obviously I don't have a very strong British accent, and asked where I was from. And I said, from the States. And he said, oh, that's cool. I'd really like to go see the Amish sometime. And I said, yep, that's where I live. 5 minutes down the road is where the Amish live. So that's where I'm from. And also wanted to say, when Anne tonight found out that I was going to be speaking, she mentioned to me that usually when I speak, it's usually quite deep. And I told her that you don't have to worry tonight. We're not going to go too deep. There's so much that you can talk about with the resurrection. You could spend hours upon hours going into it and the glory of it, the amazingness, the impact that it has on our lives. And tonight we're really just kind of going to look at the kind of arguments for the resurrection, why we as Christians believe in the resurrection, even though it is in the Bible and we believe the Bible, but there is more stronger evidence that kind of comes out of that. And you will know that people have arguments against the resurrection. For some people, it's one of the kind of biggest boundaries for Christianity is believing that Jesus was a real person who walked the earth, who died, and then miraculously rose again. So this week I bought my first car in the UK. I've owned cars before in the US, but this is my first one in the UK. And it's something that I've been researching and thinking about for a while, putting a lot of thought into it, and then kind of through an impulse decided to finally go through with it. So I don't know how many of you have bought a used car before, particularly one that's quite old. This one is 17 years old, in fact. You know that feeling after you shake the dealer's hand, you pass the money, and then you get to go on your first drive with the car. And then you're going on a drive, you hit a bump, and you hear a knock in the back. You look around the car, you realize there's some buttons that you forgot to press when the dealer was showing you the car. You press that button, doesn't work. You try to turn on the AC because it's starting to get quite warm. Just blows warm. Next day it rains. Day later you open the boot. There's a nice puddle in it. And then you wonder, was the dealer being honest when they told you that the car was perfectly good? Or did they knowingly know all these faults when they sold it to you? And you ask, where's the justice? But no, seriously, we live every day on this earth and we continue to see death. We continue to see pain, sickness, injustice. We're even watching what could be the start of World War III before our very eyes. And you have to ask yourself, is this all there is to life? Will there ever be a solution to all of this? And I'm here to tell you tonight that because of the resurrection of Jesus, we know that there will be. Because God will not tolerate all of this evil forever. If you were here a couple weeks ago, we had a fantastic night of some evangelistic training. And we watched a video of a survey that was taken in 2022 in the UK. And some free figures I just want to share with you. 54% of those interviewed believed that Jesus was a real person. So only half of people in the UK believe that Jesus was a real person. 45% believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But only 20% believe that Jesus is God. Now, if you kind of think like me, you realize that there's that interesting 25% of people that believe the resurrection was true, but did not believe that Jesus was who he says he was. And as Tim Keller says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all that he said. But if he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what he said? Now, some of you may not be as familiar with the resurrection story, so I thought it'd be really good to read one of the gospel accounts of the resurrection. So we'll be reading from John chapter 20, and if someone would mind reading verses 1 to 18 for me, that would be wonderful. So John chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. You can use a mic if you want, or just be nice and loud.
Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb, both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the stripes of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloths that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciple went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her.
Thanks so much. That's one of the accounts of the resurrection story from John. So 3 days before this is when Jesus was hung on the cross. He was crucified by the Jewish leaders and the Roman officials. He was confirmed dead with a spear in his side, and he was placed into a tomb. Now, there's 3 arguments that I kind of want to discuss and kind of make for the resurrection. So the first, the empty tomb and the eyewitness evidence is crucial to the resurrection being true. Number 2, this would have been just as much a shock to the current culture as it is to ours. And 3, there is no other explanation for the rapid change of worldview and the lengths the disciples and witnesses went to sharing their stories. So number 1, the empty tomb and eyewitness evidence is crucial to the resurrection being true. Now, some may argue that because the resurrection is listed in the Gospels, that is the only account that we have. And because the Gospels are written far after Jesus was actually crucified, about 40 years or so, they say the Gospels are too old for it to be true or to be reliable. But in fact, we see the resurrection being talked about years before in Paul's letters, specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. He says, For what I received I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. So here, about 15 to 20 years is when this letter was written. That's what historians agree it was written after Jesus' death. And Paul here is listing all the different eyewitnesses that have seen the risen Jesus. He says that Cephas, Simon Peter. And then to the 12, the disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living. Now just imagine, if you see a crime, you see a robbery or something, and you have one witness, maybe that one witness isn't reliable. But if you have 500 witnesses seeing that one crime, then probably it happened. And many of those witnesses that Paul lists, and the reason that he lists them is because they would have been alive and they would have been able to be asked about their experience, especially people that didn't believe them. They would come, and we don't see anywhere that that they weren't getting the same information. And Paul insists that he is faithfully recounting the testimony that has been handed to him. And as I mentioned in my previous night when we were talking about can we take the Bible literally, that there was in back then, historical accounts were not allowed to be changed, whereas you think they can be a little bit more fabricated now. Then it was much. It just wouldn't happen for historical accounts to be changed. Also talk about the social status of women. So we read that Mary was the first one to see the empty tomb, and she also saw the risen Jesus as the gardener. And women's social status in that culture meant that their testimony was not admissible in court. So even if all these women saw something, their testimony would mean nothing. And there would have been huge pressure to change this account to a man, but they felt that they could not do that because this would have been too well known. And you need both the empty tomb and the eyewitness accounts. If we just had the empty tomb, then no one could conclude that there was a resurrection. Perhaps the body was taken away. Perhaps it was the wrong tomb. If it was just the eyewitness accounts, well, then no one would have concluded that it was a resurrection. So there is a very strong evidence that the tomb was both empty and there were hundreds of witnesses to the risen Jesus. But you can still argue that this doesn't prove the resurrection. So my point, too, is this would have been just as much a shock to the current culture as it is to ours. See, we imagine as modern people, and we take the resurrection with skepticism, a little bit more reason in our thought. And we think that ancients back then would have immediately accepted this. But that's wrong. See, Greco and Roman thinking believed that the soul was good, but the physical world was bad, and that salvation will be liberation from our bodies, not a resurrection back into it. In fact, the Greeks and the Romans believed that no soul would ever want to go back into its body once free. What about Jewish thinking? Well, Jewish thinking did see death as a tragedy, but an individual being resurrected was still unthinkable. See, Jews believe that one day all of God's righteous would be resurrected together as a complete world renewal. But the idea that someone could be resurrected in the midst of the darkness of this world, burdened by sickness, decay, and death, well, that was ridiculous. What about the argument about disciples having hallucinations? Well, that would mean that the resurrection was imaginable to them, but it just wasn't in their worldview. Again, what about the disciples stealing the body? Well, that assumes that the disciples expected other Jews to be open to this resurrection idea, but that's just not possible. And what about the other messianic preachers that came before Jesus and ended up dead? Why didn't their disciples come up with the resurrection idea? Why would Jesus' disciples come up with it and the idea that Jesus' crucifixion was not actually a defeat, but a victory? And thirdly, there is no other explanation for the rapid change of worldview and the lengths the disciples and witnesses went to sharing their stories. So after Jesus' crucifixion, and resurrection, suddenly there's a new set of beliefs that were unthinkable before. Now they believe that this future resurrection that the Jews believed in, well, it started with Jesus. And they believe that Jesus had a transformed body, walking through walls and yet eating food. And in every other instance that we know of, such a massive shift in worldview would only happen over a period of time with lots of arguments back and forth of what they believed. And Jesus' followers say that what they're doing is telling others what they saw for themselves. Even with the highly unlikely chance a couple of disciples did come up with the resurrection idea, it never would have gotten the traction it needed. I mean, what other historical answer do we have for Jews suddenly worshiping a human as God overnight? It's just unthinkable. And how do you account for the hundreds of witnesses who publicly gave their testimonies and yet died for their beliefs? I want to read from the book. It's a quote from N.T. Wright about why the resurrection matters. So the message of the resurrection is that this world matters, that the injustices and pains of this present world must now be addressed with the news that healing, justice, and love have won. If Easter means Jesus Christ is only raised in a spiritual sense, then it is only about me and finding a new dimension in my personal spiritual life. But if Jesus Christ is truly risen from the dead, Christianity becomes good news for the whole world. News which warms our hearts precisely because it isn't just about warming hearts. Easter means that in a world where injustice, violence, and degradation are endemic, God is not prepared to tolerate such things, and that we will work and plan with all the energy of God to implement the victory of Jesus over them all. If we take away Easter, and Karl Marx was probably right to accuse Christianity of ignoring problems of the material world. Take it away, and Freud was probably right to say Christianity is wish fulfillment. Take it away, Nietzsche probably was right to say it was for wimps. So that's basically it. So there are three arguments that I kind of want to give. So the empty tomb and eyewitness evidence is crucial to the resurrection being true, and we see that in the Bible. This would have been just as much a shock to the current culture as it is to ours. And there is no other explanation for the rapid change of worldview and the lengths the disciples and witnesses went to sharing their stories. So now we're going to move into a time of discussion. So 3 questions. So the first is, what's the most popular objection that you've heard to the resurrection isn't true? Is it one of the ones that I shared tonight? Is it a different one that you've heard? Do you think there is sufficient evidence that the resurrection is true? If you don't think so, what more evidence would you need to believe that the resurrection was true? And third, if the resurrection was true, what would it mean for you? So, Peter and Andrew, slide to another group, and we'll discuss for about 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Just while the questions is, I shared in my group, Jamie and myself and, oh dear, what's your name again? Oi, that lady over there in the middle with the glasses who's typing.
What, Gracie?
Gracie, that's it. Sorry, my mind went, I have these senior moments which I'm allowed because I'm a senior, when my mind just went into neutral. I'm looking at Gracie thinking, I've forgotten your name. How could you forget Gracie? It's unforgivable. It's unforgivable. Sorry, Gracie. We've been listening to this podcast series called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God by Justin Brierley. Seriously, there is some fantastic material, particularly about the culture and the social, historical, political context of the first century that Christianity radically overturns in so many different ways. It's well worth getting into that and listening. They're a bit long. It's what they call long-form podcasts. But that's the clue, all right? So, yeah, the surprising rebirth of belief in God. So we got some questions.
We got two, three actually. The first one says, "Great job, Skyler," which I'll confess I sent that one in. Second one is, "Will Andrew's memory be better in the resurrection?" I also sent that one in as well. The answer, I believe, is yes. Thanks to grace, your memory will be better, Andrew. Yeah, see what I did there. You said that women would have been an unreliable resource and not listened to. So them being the first eyewitnesses, does it make the evidence unreliable? Skyler?
Yeah, as Andrew just whispered to me, he said, that's not the point. The fact that it does use women I think is the point. The fact that they didn't change it, the fact that they couldn't change it, because that's what that's what the witnesses saw, and that's what was told to them, was that women were the ones to see the risen Jesus, to see the empty tomb, and you wouldn't make that up, and because, so they knew that saying that women were the first ones would made it seem like it wasn't real, that the evidence meant nothing. But the fact that we do see the women just shows the historical accuracy of what happened.
That's right. And don't forget, Jesus' attitude to women was absolutely radical. The fact that he talked to a Samaritan, hated by Jews, a Samaritan woman at the well, and restored her to wholeness was phenomenal. The fact that he said to Mary, who was sat at his feet listening to him as you would sit and listen to a rabbi, women were not allowed to do that. The fact that he commended her for doing that just lifts the whole status of womanhood up, because he treated them as equals. So there's that ripple going through the Gospels. And as Skyler said, when it comes to people like Mary being witness to the resurrection, that is phenomenal. To embellish history and say, well, actually, Mary was really a bloke, or let's get rid of Mary and get her off the scene because that's embarrassing because women can't be relied upon. It just, for me, it just adds to the fact of it. Yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? That it's something that would have actually been really quite inconvenient for them at the time. For us today, it becomes one of the greatest ways in which we see the strength of the argument for the resurrection. You know, for them, it was a bit of a sore point, really, that it was women that discovered Jesus, because it made it look uncredible. But for us today, it has quite the opposite effect. How do we know the documents couldn't be edited in the past? How are they more likely to be edited today? Sorry, I wasn't here last time. That's fine, to apologise.
I've got a great answer for this. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little rhyme that some of you may know. A ring of roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, they all jumped up. Pardon? They all fell down. How do you know that? You sing it with your kids. Do you know that is hundreds of years old? It's about one of the plagues. A ring of roses is one of the rings of disease that you got. A tissue, sneezing, and then all fell down dead. That's not changed as a rhyme in hundreds of years. The people who wrote the Bible and then copied it out by hand had unbelievably strict rules, both from a Hebrew point of view and then from a Greek point of view. We think that people couldn't do accurate back then. They could do highly accurate. And because they believed it was God's word, they had strict rules to help them maintain how accurate they are. We have over 20,000 copies of different parts of the Bible from the first 300 years. which is way more than any other thing like Homer's Iliad or stuff like that. And the degree of accuracy among those copies, they say, is absolutely phenomenal. So it can be trusted.
Yeah, I think, one way of explaining it would be to think, well, imagine if you're playing Chinese whispers with a line of, say, 20 people, and you pass down the message through the chain, and you don't know, obviously, by the time it gets to the other end, obviously, normally it's comically changed to something ridiculous, and that's the way it goes. But say you had 3 lines of people, 3 lines of 20 people, and you pass the same Chinese whispers message down each 3 lines, and you get to the end, and all 3 of them say the same thing, you would then be able to say, well, with reasonable confidence, well, it must have been passed down correctly, because it's ended up as being the same, because it would be a huge coincidence for it to have changed the same way across 3 different times. Now, same sort of thing with the Bible, where we see it being copied and copied and copied, and we can see that there are different, almost lines of, sort of Chinese whispers has been passed down. And the incredible thing is that very quickly copies were being rapidly made and rapidly spread. And so, as Andrew said, it's amazing that as we look at those lines of Chinese whispers, that we have not just 3 rows, but 20,000 rows, 5,000 in the original Greek, and they all line up and say exactly the same thing, which means we can be very confident that they are accurate copies of the original as it was written down, and many of those are incredibly old. You can go to Manchester and see the oldest fragment of... No, you can't, no. I'll tell you why in a minute. You can go, in theory, you can go to Manchester and see the oldest part of John's Gospel, the Rylands fragment, which dates from 120 BC and AD, whichever one it is. Yeah, that's the right one. Obviously, it's not written before, is it? I've tried to go and see it several times, and it's always been shut or not on display when I've got there. But in theory, you can go and see it in Manchester. I have tried.
I've seen it.
You've seen it?
Yeah, I have.
Oh, shame.
It's quite cool.
Another quick one on that. So, for example, a Hebrew scholar writing out the book of Isaiah, when they'd written the whole book out, they had to do a count. They had to do a count of all the letters, all the vowels, and to the very middle vowel. And they counted it from the front, and then they counted it from the back, or in Hebrew, from the back, and then from the end, and then the beginning. And if they didn't land on exactly the same vowel, they got it wrong. And they had to go and find out where they got it wrong. Those are the kind of rules that the copyists had to understand, because they believed it was God's word. It had to be accurate. So they painstakingly worked at that. Anyway, so...
yeah. Fine.
Yeah, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Just a quick advert. If you go on our website, the church website, you can sign up to Right Now Media, which is a brilliant media website. Gracie, see, I remember your name now. Gracie is reading a book by Lee Strobel called A Case for Christ. He was a journalist in the Chicago Tribune who was an atheist who was sickened by the fact his wife became a Christian. So he set out to disprove Christianity and disprove Jesus, ended up becoming a Christian. But if you go on Right Now Media, you can get a 6-part video series where he walks you through the kind of evidence that we're thinking about tonight. Well worth doing. And you can get a free sign-up on Right Now Media. So go for it.
Brill. Next question. Please do keep sending them in, guys, and remember you can vote as well for your favourite questions. Did Jesus... oh, no, hang on. Well, there's more coming in. We read about the encounters of Mary and the disciples and others with Jesus, but where's the proof of the 500 mentioned by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, just for clarification, so where Paul mentions that is in the Bible alongside with the gospel accounts. And the fact that we see Paul mentioning this in his letter and not in the Gospels doesn't mean that it didn't happen. John specifically says in his Gospel, the reason why he wrote John's Gospel, he said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so John couldn't write everything that Jesus did. None of the writers could have wrote all that Jesus did, where he went, but all historians in this field would recognize the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, as legitimate, that it happened about 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death, that this was an actual document back in that time. And as I said, Paul mentions these witnesses because he wants people that are questioning this to go and talk to those witnesses, to hear their story, and to hear the accuracy of it.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's hard. I think all of this is quite hard, isn't it? Partly because we were saying in our group, it's difficult because you can't travel back in time and actually see it with your own eyes. And so therefore, and also the kind of evidence that we would normally require would be like photo or video, and obviously that's not, accessible to us because it didn't exist. And there's an extent to which I think all of us would say, well, if it comes to anything that happened 2,000 years ago, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert, I'm not qualified to kind of make this call myself anyway. And I think there is an extent to which we talk about in our group a bit like this, basically to look at what it is you can understand that might align you upon a trajectory, and then from that trajectory you have to make that leap of faith. But it's not a blind leap of faith, it's a leap of faith that's made on the basis of the evidence of which you can see, and then you have to make that decision and that choice upon that stuff. So it's difficult, because Paul says there's 500 people, but give me a photo. Well, we can't, obviously. It just doesn't work like that. We have to at some point make that, that sort of leap of faith. But it's a leap of faith that is it's not a blind leap of faith. It's a leap of faith that is based upon what it is I can see. And obviously something happened all those years ago, because we're all sat here today still talking about it. The question is what? And what is it by faith that you will believe it was? Because it's either by faith you believe it did happen or it didn't happen. None of us were there. None of us saw it. And yet we will all come to a position on it one way or another. How would we respond to a Muslim arguing perhaps for the miraculous revelation to Muhammad using historical documents, world influence, martyrs, etc.?
Yeah, that's a kind of a big one, and it's not quite on song for tonight, but there's a brilliant book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And again, I've forgotten his name. Qureshi?
Yeah,
Nabil Qureshi. And he was a Muslim, very brilliant young man who was trained to be a doctor, who happened to be training alongside a guy who was a Christian. So he just, over his training to be a doctor, just fired question after question after question at this guy about Christianity and about what was real about Christianity and what was true about Christianity. And that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is that this young doctor, trainee doctor, says to Nabil Qureshi, you've asked all these questions about Christianity. Why don't you turn it around and ask the same questions about Islam? So he does. And the more he asks questions about Islam in the same vein, the more it actually leads him to a point where he then begins to believe in Jesus. He has a revelation of Jesus, and then he gives his life over to follow Jesus. So it's a brilliant book. And if you want an answer to that question, that's all I'll say. Read the book, it's brilliant.
Another great resource is there's a fantastic documentary series produced by Tom Holland on exactly that topic. It's really interesting. So, I was talking about the Chinese whispers thing and a spread of all of those copies of the Gospels that happened very quickly, of the New Testament, the Bible, that happened very quickly as evidence. One of the things that we see in Islam is that the same sort of thing is happening, but there is this sense of which that there are these people who are appointed with authority to be able to say, well, this is true and this isn't. And what happens is, and I forget all the details and the names, but essentially not that long after the Quran has first been written down by Muhammad, all of the copies of the Quran are gathered, one particular set is chosen, and the rest are ordered to be destroyed, which is obviously not a great way of ensuring that you have an accurate translation of what was originally given. In fact, there's really no way of knowing, except some of those other copies, not all of them were destroyed. So later on, some of them were discovered, and obviously they didn't match up. Now, all of that is really quite controversial within Islam, because there is this culture by which the person who is the imam or the person who is, in that position of authority cannot be questioned. And that's very much a feature that exists within the Islamic tradition, which means it's very hard to actually come with these kinds of questions. I hadn't really appreciated that until I read that book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, how for the vast majority of Muslims, and all respect to them, but they tend to not ask those questions because it's very much just not within their culture to begin to ask them in the first place. But I think it's important to say we come to all these things, as it says, in the scriptures, with gentleness and respect, to listen. Those are hard conversations to have with someone who's coming from that faith position.
Just to add, if by any chance that was written by a student in Lancaster, at Events Week this week, Thursday at 6 p.m., we're going to have a conversation with a Christian and with a Muslim imam on what they believe who God is. And we did that last year, and it was just really good. So even if you're a student and didn't ask that, and you want to learn more about Islam, that'll be a great opportunity for you.
Did Jesus know that Judas was going to betray him and be the reason for his death? As he did obviously need to die in order to us be forgiven. Did he pick Judas as the disciple to fail? Was he just a sort of a pawn in the game, as it were, used by God?
Do you want to start?
I can start. Yeah, sure, thanks. I preached on it a few weeks ago. I think obviously we see that Jesus does know that Judas is going to betray him, because he do you remember in that scene in the upper room where he dips the bread in the bowl to reveal who was going to be the betrayer and gives it to Judas? At that point, nobody knows what's going to happen, and Jesus reveals that it's Judas. So obviously he knows beforehand that it is going to happen. But I think a really important principle that we must understand. And because you could say the same for Judas, you could say the same for the people that crucified Jesus, and for the people who unfairly trialed him, and the Jewish leaders. It's not just Judas who's responsible for Jesus' death. There's a whole bunch of people that are responsible for his death. What about all the people in the crowd that cried to free Barabbas instead of Jesus? And the truth is that God is more than able of taking your sin and redeeming it for good. And I think that's a theme that we see in that story in immense power, but also incredibly that you can see in your own life as well. That he can actually take the most broken things and say, do you know what, that is awful, but I can use it for good. It's a bit like in I'm not an expert, but I'm told that when you do judo, I've never done judo, but I'm told in judo that one of the ways in which it works is you use your enemy's strength against them. If anybody does judo, you can confirm that. Fact check it online. But that's exactly the same way that God works. The enemy comes against him with these things, and it's like he uses it against him. He flips it in reverse. And so Judas isn't just some sort of a pawn in the game that God decides to make him do this. As you look at the story, actually, you see the seeds of that betrayal are planted long, years beforehand. They're there, and then it comes to fruition in that moment. And God uses it for good in the end.
And if you look at Judas and try and get under his skin, first of all, some of the other records about him. One, he was thieving from the common purse that they had. Two, when a woman poured very, very expensive perfume over Jesus, he disdained that. And 3, what makes a guy who's walked with somebody like Jesus for the last 3 years end up going to the chief priests, who he is aware want to do Jesus down, and wanting money to betray him? What gets under the skin of Judas to put him in that place? And what you get is a broken man who, even though Jesus knew he would betray him, and in one sense there was a prophetic journey that Judas was on, he's clearly exercising his own broken free will, very clearly. And that and everything Jamie said.
Very good.
Does it say in the Bible the guards guarded the tomb after Joseph and the women put Jesus' body in the tomb and put the stone in front where they all are at that time?
So I'll read from Matthew 27, starting from verse 62. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So that's Matthew's account of a guard going to the tomb. I mentioned the last time I spoke, I know not everyone was here, that obviously the Gospels they do vary a bit from each other. And that's because there's different writers, they talk to different eyewitnesses. For instance, John doesn't mention that women were there at the burial, but the others do, those sorts of things. But because they're different doesn't mean that, that it's wrong. For me, if all of them were exactly the same, word for word, that would mean a lot less to the true evidence of it than if they were slightly different. But also, I just wanted to say, I don't know exactly where you're coming from with this question of if there were guards that guarded the tomb. But for me, it doesn't really matter if there was a guard at the tomb because of the different evidence that I talked about and the arguments. And specifically, if the disciples were able to remove the body, why? Why would they? Why did the body never show up again? That sort of thing. As a dead body, I mean.
So in our group, Graham kind of made the point that the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb, for a Roman soldier to fail in their duty meant summary execution. And there's an example of that in the book of Acts when there's an earthquake when Paul and Silas are in prison, and the Philippian jailer he believes because of the earthquake and everybody's been kind of all the prison doors have flown open or whatever, he thinks they've all escaped, and he's about to take his own life because his life would have been taken the following morning if the prisoners had escaped. He'd failed in his duty. And Paul shouts out, don't do it, because we're all here. None of us have run away. And that actually led the Philippian jailer to Christ. So that's an example. But we know that, or the records are that the guards, once the resurrection had happened, were paid off by the Pharisees and the chief priests to tell a lie. They were paid to tell the lie that Jesus' body had been stolen by the disciples, and the priest said, "We'll pay you to tell the lie, and we'll pay your superiors to keep their mouths shut, and not to have you executed." So the fix was in on that, but that's the story. Read it, Matthew 28, Matthew 27, 28. You'll pick that story up.
Fantastic. One final question, and we'll make this brief, and this will be the last one, which is a little bit off-piste. Love off-piste. But if all the Gospels were the same, don't you think we'd be praising God for their accuracy too? Well, I think what Skyler's saying is, you know what, if they were like word for word the same, they'd obviously they've just been kind of copied from each other, but there's a sense in which there is an incredible accuracy between them all, but they all have the hallmarks of genuine eyewitness testimony, in that if you and I saw the same, you know, event, car accident or whatever happened on Lancaster, and we're both interviewed by the police, our accounts would be different but describing the same event, and there'd be a degree of accuracy from which those two statements you could determine the truth, but we would obviously use different words. If we use the same words, the police officer would rightly think there's something quite suspicious going on here. Why have they done that? But because, yeah, does that make sense? I'm sure that makes sense.
Well, a great example of that, I think I shared this last time we talked about it. When my youngest daughter was 18, she was knocked down at our nearby traffic lights and nearly killed. And she was in hospital for nearly 6 weeks because for the first 5 weeks she was dying because they couldn't find out what had happened to her. Turns out some of her internal organs had been far more badly damaged than they thought. However, after a few months, the police officer who had investigated the accident came to us and said, "We really would like to take this guy to court because it's clear that he jumped a red light and therefore ran into your daughter, but we can't because none of the witnesses' evidence corroborates, and the defence would just tear it to shreds. We don't believe anybody's not telling the truth. It's just that they all saw it from such a different angle. Their evidence gave a different perspective on the same thing that it doesn't add up." And we were like, "Thanks very much for coming and telling us that." And I don't believe any of them were lying, but it built up a picture that the defence would rip apart. And so that just kind of the scene that we all see things from different perspectives. And you've got 4 Gospels with incredible similarities, but then the different perspectives add a richness, and a student's demand to look at that carefully that actually kind of embellishes it or embodies it or bodies it out, you know. So I enjoy it that it's different. It challenges me. It makes me think hard and work it out, especially when you get 2 Gadarene demoniacs in some Gospels and only one in another. What's that all about? Still working that one out.
Great.
Brill. We're there.
Brill. One last thought. Today, personally, the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ is the central thing that has changed my life. And I know across the world, many of my brothers and sisters in countries where they're persecuted, the one thing that keeps them living, keeps them hoping, keeps them standing for Jesus and not betraying him, is that they have met the risen Lord Jesus Christ, and it's changed their lives 2,000 years later. And we praise God for that. Let's worship him. Thanks, Georges.